Hello everyone, my name is Brendan Snyder. Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to our year-end special, a countdown of the 22 best albums of 2022. So this was a really good year in my opinion. A lot of great albums came out. Actually, back in July when we were at the halfway point, 6 months through the year, I did a best of so far countdown, and a lot of those albums are actually pushed out of this at this point. I mean, there was so much great music that came out in the second half of the year. I had to make room for it. So it got all mixed up and everything. Things got shuffled around. If you're interested in what the countdown was 6 months ago, I will leave a link in the description. I'll also leave a little, what they call a card, just pointing out there. You can click on it kind of thing. And go check that out too and do a little comparison of your own. But yeah, we've got a lot to do here, some really great stuff. I'm going to dive into it here in just a bit. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please click the button. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Hey, and of course, if you subscribe, you're going to stay up to date on all that's going on in the world of music, just like this with a countdown of the 22 best albums of 2022. So before we dive into this, I did want to give a shout out for a couple honorable mentions. The first one up being the reunion album from Talus. This is Billy Sheehan's band, you know, coming from Mr. Big and David Lee Roth. That album really blew me away. It was just one of those albums that the more and more I listened to it, the better it got. It's simply called 1985. That's the title of it, and it's a pretty accurate title for the sound and style of music that's on there, so pretty great. Another one that I wasn't even planning on picking up, but I went ahead and did, and turned out it was the best album of that week when it came out. There was a lot of good stuff that came out with it. House of Lords and their latest album, which is called Saints and Sinners. This one here has Mark Mangold on keyboards joining in, and I think he really mixed things up for them and sort of gave them a good punch, a good push, and so forth, because this album here is just far superior to any of their last few albums. Not to say those albums weren't good, they were great. I really, really like this one. So definitely give a shout out to those. Go check those out, honorable mentions. But without further ado, let's kick into the 22 best albums of 2022 and coming in 2022. First one up being Jethro Tull, The Zealot Gene. This was, I think, actually the first one released of the new year kind of thing. So I've lived with this one now for a year. It was their 22nd studio album, and it was their first new album of original material in 23 long years. And it does feature an entirely new lineup of the band, so don't let that deter you from this thing, because it's really, really quite good. And while this is not a concept album in here, the songs focus on similar ideas like human traits, emotions, stuff like that. So there's a nice consistency, not only musically, but lyrically throughout, making it a really strong album. Okay, next up, we got Australian rockers coming in at 21, Midnight Oil, Resist. 13th studio album from them, and a reunion album at that. It's actually been 20 years since their last album, Cornucopia, in 2002, and it does feature the final recordings of Bones Hillman, their bassist, who unfortunately passed away in 2020. It was very sad when that happened back at the beginning of the pandemic and everything. This one here, though, I found the album to be a bit more quiet and reflective than past albums, but it's not to say that there aren't still moments of indignation, rage, power, the sort of things that really fuel the band lyrically and emotionally and that sort of stuff. So that's all still on here, and it still does have that classic Midnight Oil sound, making it a great album. Coming in at number 20, we've got Red Hot Chili Peppers' Unlimited Love, 12th studio album, first of 2 albums released this year, so we'll have to wait and see where that other one comes in. This one here, produced by Rick Rubin, did mark the return of guitarist John Frusciante, and he'd been absent on the last 2 albums. So this album here, definitely, classic sounding. It's got that melodic yet funky sound that we know the Peppers for. With Frusciante coming back, it returned them to that era between 99 and 2009 that they recorded, Californication, Stadium Arcadium, stuff like that. While this is nowhere near that, arguably that is their best period, and this album here, I think, trumps the last 2, and I think this is a great return to form style in that regard, and is a good album. Coming in at number 19, Tears for Fears, The Tipping Point, 7th studio album from them. First one in 17 years. I mean, if you haven't noticed, there's a lot of these artists that are putting out albums after a long time, and that was kind of a great thing. Maybe, you know, one of the only pluses out of the whole pandemic and everything. Gave a lot of bands time to do that. But yeah, first new album in 17 years since their 2004 album, Everybody Loves a Happy Ending. This one does feature the 2 original members, so we do have Roland Orzabal and Kurt Smith, so nice that they're back together on this. But I think this one here outshines that last album, and it's actually some of the best material of their entire career. I go back to this album quite a bit and have really enjoyed it. Next up, coming in at number 18, we've got Eagles bassist Timothy B. Schmidt, Day by Day, 7th solo album, also recorded during the pandemic. He had time off. His main day job, the Eagles, weren't touring, so he got to go do that. I have to say, this album here really surprised me. It just connected with me far more than his other stuff. I've always liked Timothy B. Schmidt. I think he's got a beautiful voice, and I love the melodies and things he comes up lyrically when he's singing. But this one here just really connected with me, especially the first track, Simple Man. And I think part and parcel it has to do with the fact that it's got former Fleetwood Mac guitarist Lindsey Buckingham guesting on it. I'm a big Lindsey Buckingham fan, so his guitar playing immediately stood out to me on that. Coming in at number 17, we got Michael Schenker Group, Universal, 12th studio album that's under his name, because he has done a bunch of different things with the Michael Schenker name in it, but MSG, Michael Schenker Group, this one being the 12th. Unlike his last album that had a lot of different vocalists on it and stuff, and I thought was very inconsistent, this one here has a primary vocalist and Ronnie Romero singing. We do have some other vocalists on here, but it's not quite as varied as the last one, and so I think it provides a much more consistent listen throughout, something that I really, really enjoyed more about this album than the past one. I also think this one has a very classic feel to it, sort of reminiscent of their glory days. Okay, next one, we've got Supergroup coming in at 16, Black Swan, Generation Mind, their 2nd studio album. If you're not familiar with the band, it's got Robin McCauley on vocals coming from MSG, Reb Beach on guitar from Winger and White Snake, Jeff Pilson on bass, formerly of Dokken, currently with Foreigner, and Matt Starr on drums, who at the time was part of Mr. Big, but as I understand it, they've got a new drummer, so now I guess he is ex-Mr. Big, but great drummer nonetheless. Good to have him in here. And so what's really cool is this band sort of takes the best bits of all of their respective bands and it rolls it into one here. And I just think that this is what a true supergroup album should be about. The album itself is more than just the sum of its parts. All right, coming in at number 15, Steve Vai and Violate, 10th solo album from him. First of all, new material in a decade, if you can believe that one. What's cool about this is it's all instrumental. There's no vocal on this. And he's trying a bunch of new guitar techniques. That's something cool about Steve Vai. He's always growing, pushing himself as a musician. I mean, even 40 years on, he's still doing that. And so the albums themselves are always really interesting listens because he never just goes back and replicates anything. Coming in at number 14, The Fix, Every 5 Seconds, 13th studio album, 10 years since their last album, Beautiful Friction, came out in 2012. Again, just, you know, a lot of these great bands making these returns here. While the last album, Beautiful Friction, was really good, I found myself going back to this one time and time again, really enjoying this one. A lot of classic elements, little, you know, classic moments on this. Very good feeling all the way throughout on this one. And for me, it was just like returning to 1983, you know, when the Fix started out and everything. So really cool. Coming in at number 13, GNR guitarist Slash, featuring Miles Kennedy and the Conspirators, their album number 4, which is also their 4th studio album. The whole thing was recorded live in the studio, so everyone playing together really, I think, helped bring this album together, giving it a consistency, made the band connect on all different levels. They're firing on all cylinders, that kind of thing, so it makes for a really strong album. I kind of hope that they proceed and continue doing that. The band definitely feeds off one another when performing, and that comes across in this album here. And coming in at number 12, we've got German rockers, the Scorpions, Rock Believer, their 19th studio album. First new album for them in 7 years, making it the longest gap between studio albums for the band. This one's also the first one with former Motorhead drummer Mickey D joining in, and he really seems to have sort of kicked the band into high gear, giving them a bunch of new energy and everything. And the cool thing with this one, like Slash's album, the band recorded this one live in the studio together as a group, the way that they did back in the 80s, and that too, I think, helped bring a lot of energy to this album. All right, so we're halfway there. Coming in now at number 11 here, Megadeth, The Sick, The Dying, The Dead, 16th studio album for them. First to feature their new drummer, Dirk Van Buren from Soilwork. So even though James Lomenzo is listed as the bassist on here, he did not play on it. I am glad he's back in the band, returning, because he did play with them previously. But we've got bass parts on here from Steve DiGiorgio. He's played with Death, Testament, so very cool to have him on board. The album itself is very good. I found the thing to be, fairly classic in its sound and throughout, and it's a lot of sort of peaks and valleys and stuff, keeping my interest all the way through on it. And coming in at number 10, we've got Ozzy Osbourne, Patient Number 9, 13th solo album from him, produced and co-written and performed by Andrew Watt. Now, if you're not familiar with him, first he plays with Glenn Hughes and California Breed. Goes on, he's playing with Ozzy, not to mention he's done a bunch of pop stuff out in the world. But he's got a new album that he's done with Iggy Pop, and then after that he's got one with Morrissey. So I mean, this guy is playing with the who's who of everybody, and they all seem to love him, and he's churning out some great albums, some good return to form albums, just like this one that's right here. So not to mention all of that, we got a bunch of cool guest guitar players on this, which I think really helped elevate this, making it more than just the run-of-the-mill type Ozzy stuff. We've got Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Tony Iommi, Zakk Wylde returns here, Mike McCready of Pearl Jam. Then we've got some other cool guests on here. We've got Chad Smith of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Taylor Hawkins, formerly of the Foo Fighters before he passed away, Duff McKagan of Guns N' Roses, and Chris Chaney of Jane's Addiction. So you just mix all that in on here, and of course it is a really good classic sounding album. Coming in at number 9, Journey, Freedom, 15th studio album from them. First in over a decade since Eclipse. Here's another one. That was 2001. This one is the third album with current vocalist Arnel Pineda. First thing I noticed about this, though, is that it doesn't really sound like any other album. There's a lot of modern influences in it. I don't know if that is their newest keyboardist coming into play, Jason Derlaka, or not, but the band definitely still shows themselves growing and exploring after nearly 50 years together, so kudos to them on that. And yeah, it keeps things interesting. They're not retreading the past, and I do respect that. Coming in at number 8, we've got Red Hot Chili Peppers, Return to the Dream Canteen. So the second album that they released in 2022. 12th studio album, and of course, again, featuring John Frusciante on here. 18 more songs than what we already had from Unlimited Love, so all recorded together. Apparently there's even more songs still out there that they could gather up. Maybe we'll see another album, who knows. Again, produced by Rick Rubin, but I have to say that I found this one here to be the superior of the two. I like the tracks off this one much better. I felt that the first album was a bit more mellow by comparison to this one, and this one here just grabbed and holds me longer on the album than the first one did. So I had to mark this one and move it up closer to the top spot. All right, coming in at number 7, Municipal Waste, Electrified Brain, 7th studio album from them. This is one of those newer thrash bands, but when I say newer thrash bands, it's really just basing it on being newer than any of the bands out of the 80s, because these guys formed in 2001, so they've already been around 21 years, but they are still delivering some really amazing old school thrash, even better than some of those bands that started it off and originated it back 40 years ago. So if you're looking for that, definitely check out this new one. In my opinion, it is their best album yet. Coming in at number 6, Ghost, Impera, 5th studio album from this band. For me, the album itself just got better and better, and it's one of those ones, every time I listen to this thing, it just keeps growing. And I thought that Prequel was really, really good, and I didn't think they were going to top it, but in my opinion, this one is at least on par, if not better than that album. And I know that's saying a lot, but I'm really, really enjoying this album. Spillways alone, just a classic track. I could listen to that one all day long. Coming in at number 5, maybe a surprise to you guys, but I got punk legend Jerry Only, Anti-Hero, and his debut solo album, of course, from the Misfits founder, bassist, vocalist. The cool thing with this album, one of the reasons that I really, really dig it, and I recognize that it's partly a nostalgia thing, but it's got the last lineup of the Misfits before Glenn Danzig joined in. And so I'm a big fan. I've been a fan of theirs since 1997 on, and yes, that is the reunion era of it, or the reformed era, or whatever you want to call it, without Glenn Danzig. But I absolutely love that era. And so the fact that we've got that last lineup of that has Jerry Only on vocals and bass, Jerry Other on guitar, Eric Chupacabra on drums, and AC Slade on guitar. So this would have been a Misfits album had they not reformed with Danzig and were touring and so forth. So for me, that's how I see it, and it just is really good. It's tops in my opinion. I put this thing on and I just couldn't stop smiling through the whole first listen on that thing. That's how good and how much I enjoyed getting that this year. All right, next up, number 4, alternative rockers, The Cult, Under the Midnight Sun, 11th studio album from them. First new music in 6 years. Hidden City came out back in 2016, I think it was, so really cool. This album here is interesting. I feel that it's split into 2 sides, and maybe that was intentional because on a vinyl you actually have that CD, not the case, but the first 4 songs to me are very different than the second 4 songs. 8 total songs on the album. First side just rocks a little bit more than second. It's not that harder rock album, but the first half of it does. The second one is more orchestral. It's sort of darker. Both of them are very orchestral, or atmospheric in a way. So really interesting how that's done though. You got the rockier side, you've got the more orchestral side, but both of them are atmospheric. And that in and of itself makes for a very interesting listen throughout. And this one too, when I put it on, it didn't hit me. It took 2, 3, 4, 5 listens, whatever. And I wasn't trying to, it just was one of those ones that when I got done, I wanted to start it over. And then again and again. And now I find it to be such a good album that it is coming in at number 4. All right. Down to the top 3 here. Prog Metal Heroes, number 3, Queensryche, Digital Noise Alliance, DNA, 16th studio album from the band. So despite the band itself only having 2 original members left in it, I actually think that this album here is the closest to their classic sound of the classic era, particularly Empire from 1990. So both songwriting, production, those things right there, I think, is what brings this across. And when I put this on immediately, I felt that I happen to be a big fan of the Empire era. That's when I came into them. So previous stuff that they had been doing was more of the early to mid 80s and so forth. But we've got that here, and I think that's pretty cool with this album. It's got a much more rock vibe to it than the metal vibe of the earlier years and so forth. So this album here was just a super, super surprise to me, and why it's coming in at number 3. All right, coming in at number 2, this one easily could have been my number 1. We got glam metal titans Skid Row. The gang's all here, and I know we can argue whether they're glam metal or not, but that's what I call them. 6th studio album from them. First to feature newest vocalist Eric Gronwall. He's formerly of the band Heat. Also first to feature drummer Rod Hammersmith on a studio album. Now, he had played on 2 EPs before this, but it is the first time he is appearing on one of their albums. This one here just blew me away. I didn't know what to expect. I wasn't really happy with the last few things that Skid Row had released. It had been so long. They kept changing singers. They had gone through about 3 different singers since the last album and so forth. And so I didn't have high hopes for this. And I have to say, from start to finish, this album kicks. I love it. It's a throwback to their classic era. It's a nice bridge between the debut and Slave to the Grind. If you're in love with those era, either of those eras of the band, definitely recommend this one here. All right, and the number 1 album of 2022, we've got 80s rockers, Def Leppard, Diamond Star Halos. So that was my number 1 in the previous. It has remained. I did look and check to see if anything else could move on up, but I have to say that this one here, their 12th studio album, first one in 7 years for them, and like a lot of these other bands, recorded it during the lockdown over a 2-year period. So, again, if anything else, man, it made bands like Def Leppard and some of these other groups that take forever to make albums to churn them out But this one here, huge surprise, not only in its announcement and that they were doing it and it was coming out, but in its overall sound and style. You know, it's not a throwback to their 80s heyday, and I don't think it ever will be. Kind of the closest thing was their previous album, the self-titled. But this one here, for whatever reason, from start to finish, is really, really good. The band itself was sort of making an homage to their glam rock heroes, and they just wrote some really, really great songs on here. And I put it on before I was doing this, and it still just really grabbed me and pulled me in. And I gotta say, that is why this album here, Def Leppard's Diamond Star Halos, ran for the entire year's time as my favorite album of 2022. So there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed that. 22 albums of 2022, plus 2 bonus ones at the beginning, honorable mentions, so you got 24 there. As a related video, I am going to leave a link to the 21 best albums of 2021 from last year. If you want to see what made that, I will put a link in the description and you can check that out. So hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, please remember to comment, like, and subscribe right there. Have a great one, and I'll be seeing you guys in the new year. Bye-bye.